Welcome, alumni and friends of St. Mary's College. We are thrilled to have you joining us for our May Spirituality Hour. I'm Molly Kahn Allen, class of 2001 and member of the Alumni Association Board of Directors. It's my pleasure to play host tonight. Our topic rather this evening is Women Responding to the Spirit, 40 Years of the Madeleva Lecture at St. Mary's. Our format for this evening is we will begin with introductions, then we have a presentation from our authors, and we will also then take question and answers. This is situated as a webinar format, so you will be able to use the Q&A function to respond to those. And this is also being recorded, so we will make it available to to the rest of you who may want to listen later, or we hope that you will share it with your friends or other alumni clubs. It is truly my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Horan, who is a professor of philosophy and religious studies and theology at director of the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's College. He is also an affiliated professor of spirituality at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. He's a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. He's the author or editor of 16 books, including Engaging Thomas Merton, Spirituality, Justice, and Racism and Fear, and Fear and Faith, Hope and Wholeness in a Fractured World. He is the recipient of numerous awards for his writing and service and is co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. We also have Dr. Jessica Coblentz, who is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College. She's the author of the award-winning book, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, and the co-editor of 3 volumes, including Women Responding to the Spirit, Selections from the Madeleva Lecture. It is truly my pleasure to welcome them both, and they're going to share with us their work, the Women Responding to the Spirit. Welcome, Dr. Horan and Dr. Coblentz.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's really a joy to be with everybody who's here virtually with us live and those who might be tuning in later. Um, so our plan for this evening is to tell you a little bit about the history of the Madeleva Lecture here at St. Mary's College, to talk about then the formation, the kind of working, the development of this book project, and then to talk about some of the key themes that are contained throughout the book, which organize the various lectures over 40 years, and to highlight some of the ways that both Professor Coblentz and I think that these themes, these reflections, the insights of these amazing women scholars continue to be relevant today. Without further ado, I'm going to get started. As the sitting director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality, we just completed our 40th anniversary year, and one of the reasons we're so excited this book came out when it did is that it serves as something of a bookend to our celebration. Back in October on campus, we hosted an in-person 2-day conference on the life and legacy of Sister Madeleva Wolf, for whom the annual lecture is named. That was organized by my colleague here, Jessica Coblentz, as well as another colleague of ours, and myself hosted at the center. And so we consider that the opening of this 40th anniversary year of the center and this book's publication and this year's Madeleva Lecture delivered by Dr. Kathy Cummings of the University of Notre Dame was sort of the closure, the bookend. The vision for the Madeleva Lecture goes all the way back to the founding of the center in the fall of 1984. Earlier that year, Dr. Keith Egan came to St. Mary's College from Marquette University, where he was on faculty for many years, to join the Department of Religious Studies, as it was known then, and now Religious Studies and Theology. As chair of the department, he made a kind of pitch to the president at the time that he had this desire to create a center for spirituality And in the 1980s, spirituality was not understood in the kind of universal way that it is today. That spirituality was seen as sort of a fringe sort of concept within the world of theology, and even for like everyday Christians in the pews, you might have known about devotionals or novenas and prayer practices and sodalities and so forth. But the study of spirituality, the reflection on lived practice, the embodiment of one's faith tradition was not taken as seriously, and let alone in an academic context. And Dr. Egan, who passed away earlier this semester, um, knew he had this passion for bringing spirituality to a larger audience, particularly within the academy, and he was especially committed to supporting and elevating the voices, the research, the work of women scholars, especially theologians, and those women who are working in the field of spirituality, which is a fairly new discipline in the 1980s. So, inspired by Sister Madeleva Wolf, who founded the School of Sacred Theology at St. Mary's College in the early 20th century, but then had sunset the program in the late 1960s, Dr. Egan wanted to have a flagship lecture that would bring folks to the college from the University of Notre Dame, Holy Cross College, the broader community, the Chicagoland area, and really from all over the place to celebrate the theological contributions of women in the field. So when the center was founded, you can go back to the college archives and see that in the original proposal for a Center for Spirituality, as it was called then, included an annual lecture yet to be named, later to be named after Sister Madeleva Wolf, that would do precisely this. And the very first lecture took place in the spring of 1985 on the campus of St. Mary's, delivered by Dr. Monica Helwig, who is a giant in the field of American Catholic education and Catholic theology. Keith's vision at that time was that the lecture would help not only spread the word and encourage others to study theology, especially women, but that the publication of the lecture, an expanded version that would be published as a small book, would serve as a fundraising mechanism to help fund the work of the center. So, over 40 years, each of these public lectures, the Madeleva Lectures, were then published as a volume, many of which, almost all of which, are still in print. And the proceeds of the publication of that book went on to support the good work of the Center for the Study of Spirituality. It continues to support the work that we do today. So it's that real sort of long-term vision that Dr. Egan had, that really set the center and St. Mary's College in a really great position moving forward. I want to say just a couple other things, one of which is an acknowledgement of a Madeleva lecturer who actually died just yesterday, and to acknowledge and recognize and celebrate her life and work. And that is Dr. Wendy Wright, who for many years was on the faculty of Creighton University, a profound scholar, an internationally renowned scholar, particularly in the area of Salesian studies, so the work of Francis de Sales and those in that tradition, as well as other areas of French spirituality, French Catholic spirituality. After her retirement at Creighton, she returned to her native California to be closer to her children and grandchildren, and continued to teach and to mentor graduate students at the Oblate School of Theology. Like myself, she was for many years an affiliated faculty member there at that institution. So we definitely want to acknowledge her great work. Her contribution is included in this volume, and her whole volume continues of her lecture from 2010 is still available for purchase in its entirety. The last thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to Jess, to Dr. Coblentz, to talk about how we came together in the working of this volume, which took place over many years. I want to highlight that we've had an annual Madeleva lecture every year with three exceptions. The first is in 2015, the director of the center at that time decided to host a panel of young Catholic women's voices. And so this was a kind of a reflection backward and forward on the state of women in the church and women in theology, not from the perspective of senior scholars like are often our lecturers, but from the experience of younger women, college age women, and the like. So there was no publication that particular year. We had two other years when we didn't have a lecture. The first was in 2020 when, because of the global pandemic, as you might recall, necessitated the cancellation or the postponement of a lecture. So there was none held that year. And then in 2022, the lecturer that was set to give the annual Madeleva Lecture encountered a number of health concerns, and sadly and regrettably, we had to cancel that lecture as well. I'll just offer one last kind of Madeleva Lecture trivia item, which is we've had only one repeat lecturer, and that is Professor Sandra Schneider's IHM from the Jesuit School of Theology in California, who delivered one of the earliest Madeleva lectures and then was invited back, I think in the year 2000, if memory serves me right, to deliver a second Madeleva lecture. So she wins the Guinness Book of World Records for most Madeleva lectures. Um, to hand this over to my colleague here, I just want to say that this project, a kind of a compendium of the best of the Madeleva lectures, you might say, was something that Dr. Keith Egan believed in and wanted published. It's a project that was on his horizon that he talked about regularly with Paulus Press, our publishing collaborators, but was never able to see it through to completion. So when a few years ago we were able to tell him that this project, at the invitation of the publisher, was underway, he was absolutely thrilled. So although Professor Egan entered eternal life just a few months before this book came off the press, he knew it was on its way, and I think a fitting sort of tribute not only to him but to all of the women that are honored in this volume. So with that, Jess, maybe you can pick up what that looked like once we got rolling.
Sure thing. Let me just first add my thanks to all of you who are gathered to hear about this exciting project and to celebrate 40 years of the Madeleva Lecture. As Professor Horan said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this reader that we worked on together as co-editors that gathers selections from almost all of the Madeleva lectures during the last 40 years. As Professor Horan said, this project, or a project like it that gathered selections from these lectures over the year, preceded both of our time at St. Mary's, but we were both very lucky that it was an idea that did not die over the years. When Dan came on as the director of the center in 2021, our longstanding publishers of the Madeleva volumes, one comes out every year following the lecture with Paulus Press, they reached out to Dan and shared this idea with him. And immediately they agreed that this 40th year anniversary of the center would be the perfect occasion to put together a volume that would collect in one place some of the wisdom from these incredible lectures, so that for those of us who've been following the Madeleva Lecture for many years, we might have a sort of new way to encounter some of this wisdom. For others, maybe who aren't lucky enough to be a part of the St. Mary's community and know all about the Madeleva Lecture already, this kind of one volume might be an entry point to introduce people to this long-standing series of lectures on spirituality. And so I was lucky to be invited onto this project when Dan and Paulus Press started talking. We're happy that Paulus Press gave us a lot of freedom as we started envisioning the project. Paul McMahon, who was one of our project collaborators in sort of envisioning this early on, said, there's lots of ways to do a reader of this kind, right? We could have a volume that gathered little excerpts from all of the lectures. We could instead just pick a few lectures and have longer excerpts from them. We could organize them chronologically. We could organize them thematically. It was really exciting to have so much freedom in the early stages of this project to think about what a Madeleva lecture reader might look like. But as you might imagine, sometimes that freedom can be a little daunting, right? So early on, we faced the challenge as co-editors of trying to sort of set some parameters on the project. One of the first things that we realized was that, as Dan already mentioned, this reader project was going to take the two of us many years to put together. After all, we would be, gathering excerpts from, 30 something lectures. That was going to take us a lot of time. And of course, any of you who know about book publishing know that that also takes some time. So we decided that the last lecture that we were going to include in this reader needed to be one that was already in print. And that was Nancy Pineda Madrid's 2019 lecture. We also decided that we would exclude any excerpts from the years where there wasn't a volume printed. So, for example, these years when they did a panel, like the Young Women's Voices year. There was also a year when instead of a single lecture, the Madeleva Lecture was celebrated with a panel of women talking about Vatican II, which didn't come out in printed form, and so we were going to exclude those. And we also decided too that one of the Madeleva lectures that we both really loved and cherished would maybe be engaged in a unique way, and that was Gail Porter Mandel's biography lecture of Sister Madeleva. Early on, we realized we wanted to talk a little bit about Sister Madeleva as a way to introduce the Madeleva lecture and the reader. And so we would include Mandel's lecture and the biography of Sister Madeleva in our introduction. That left us with 32 Madeleva lectures to comb through and organize for our reader. What Dan and I decided to do was to take an inductive approach to these 32 lectures and organizing them for the reader. That is, instead of deciding in advance that we wanted to organize it in a particular way, we committed to reading through all 32 printed lectures that we were going to include and to sort of approach them with an open mind, asking, what excerpts, what passages from these lectures could stand alone and bring kind of wisdom for our day. So we didn't want to assume that any readers of our volume would necessarily be familiar with any of the Madeleva lectures before. So we really wanted to identify passages that could stand alone and would strike people as relevant without the larger context of the lecture. So we set out first, kind of separately or in parallel, reading these on our own. And as you can imagine, this was both a thrilling and a sort of daunting task. It was really wonderful to have an occasion to sort of start at the beginning of the Madeleva lectures and read through them over the years. Already, I mean, even before I was a faculty member at St. Mary's, I just sort of cherished this lecture series. And so to get to revisit some of the lectures that I've read many times, but also to read some of the Madeleva lectures that maybe I'd heard of but never had an occasion to read already, was a really kind of intellectually stimulating pursuit for me, and also quite spiritually nourishing. At the same time, as I said, there were some challenges. For one, a lot of these lectures are just striking in the beauty of their prose. And I think part of that, I suspect, is the result of the unique format of this lecture series, right? It's not often that a book is printed after a lecture is given. In other words, all these manuscripts were originally crafted to be heard. And I think because of that, the writing is often more accessible than maybe your average academic text. And also the authors got to deliver the content first and get some feedback and sort of think about it before it goes into book form. So I find that on the whole, these Madeleva lectures are really beautiful texts. And so it actually made it kind of hard sometimes to choose which passages to sort of excise because I often wanted to keep it all. Another challenge that I found as we went through this process was that some of these Madeleva lectures were actually so familiar to me that it was hard to imagine what it would be like to encounter just an excerpt of them as a standalone text. So, for instance, there's a Madeleva lecture by the psychologist and spiritual writer Sidney Callahan that I frequently teach in my classes with students, particularly classes on theologies and mental health. And I've taught this book so many times and had so many conversations with students about it that it was really hard to imagine, how do I pick one part of it for the reader? The beauty of the process that unfolded in this reader was that I didn't have to make that decision alone. After Professor Horan and I kind of read these texts separately and made notes of which passages we might be able to excerpt for the reader, we then got together and compared notes. We went lecture by lecture and saw where we might overlap in the selections that we identified, where we might have been totally different in our thinking. And to our very pleasant surprise, we found that more often than not, we often identified the same passages or overlapping passages. So in the end, it worked out very nicely which passages we wanted to feature. And it also became clear that we would be able to include an excerpt from all of the lectures that we were considering. There's just sort of a bounty of things to choose from, and it made the most sense to include all the lecturers within the parameters that we have set. It was after that we started to think about how to organize these passages. As I mentioned, we were asking, should we organize the whole book chronologically? Should we do it some other way? And what we were really struck by after we identified the passages that we wanted to include was that there were some sort of emerging themes that we could use to organize the lecture, or excuse me, the reader. And we ended up, as you'll see if you take a look at the book, identifying 5 major themes that we use as sort of chapters to organize the excerpts in the book. We're going to turn to that next, so I'll turn things over to Dan to tell you a little bit about these 5 themes. I will just say as a caveat that there were more than 5 themes, and maybe we can talk a little bit more later in our conversation about some of the themes that we saw emerging from these lectures that we didn't actually use as organizing principles, but were nevertheless compelling. So, Dan, why don't you take it away?
Sure. I might just also add too to highlight this project. What Jess just outlined was about 2 years in total. Part of that was just on top of our regular teaching and other responsibilities and writing and those sorts of things. Reading through all 32 of these with that kind of attentiveness that's required that we wanted to give in honor of these lecturers and their legacy was a very slow but very good process. I'll also add that, like Professor Coblentz said, when we did kind of sit down to compare notes, and we did this periodically, almost once a month, kind of chunking up chronologically these different lectures, it's true that we did have a lot of sections that sort of overlapped. And so there was really a discernment there. The title of the book is Women Responding to the Spirit, but we could also add, in terms of the process, editors responding to the Spirit, trying to
Yes.
follow the sections. But, in this abbreviated form, like it's probably too boring to hear all the insides and outs of this, but we also had these like massive sections that we would agree on, but couldn't decide what parts of that. We had a word limit from the publisher. So, like, trying to balance 32 full little books, full lectures in this way was itself really daunting, even when we had overlap over what we felt was like a really ideal piece. So, I'll just add one other layer, if I may, that I don't know that came through very strongly, is that some of these, going back to the 80s, there were some digital versions of some of these texts that the publisher could send us, but we actually transcribed, typed up the sections from the original lectures into a manuscript that we then reviewed again and again to try to find, okay, well, this section actually could be tightened a little bit more, or, maybe we need to add a little bit more for context. So it was a very involved process, and one that really required us being very, very close to these texts. I have joked with some previous Madeleva lecturers who are colleagues and friends of ours, but also people who have come back, for instance, to the annual Madeleva lecture, that Jess and I probably know their lecture better than they know it at this point, because we spent so much time and have been so close to these, which might be a good way to kind of build on what was already shared in terms of the process, to say, yes, we came up with these five themes, and the way that we identified them, as Professor Coblentz said, there was a whole range of themes. Like, we could have organized these in lots of ways, but one thing, when we were getting toward the end, when this came fairly late in the process, was the how to structure, how to organize these, and how to weigh the chapters, so there wasn't like one theme that had 40% of the book and then the other four themes had just 10% each. So how do we do this that's true to the themes and the messages and the insights and wisdom of each of these distinctive lectures and their authors, and at the same time create a balance so that the reader can have an experience of continuity, of a sort of organic flow to the text themselves. Which, again, I mean, this is the spirituality hour here. We would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge there is the movement of the Holy Spirit present here, because there's 32 different texts, 32 different scholars, and yet there is something that brings them together. And then in each of these five chapters, a theme that kind of brings them even closer together. So I'll just name them, and then what we've decided to do is kind of like this, maybe be a little bit more informal, to talk about for a few minutes on each of the five areas, to talk about things that struck us or that we think are continually relevant, things that you may be interested in, that could help spur maybe some conversation, some questions or comments from you all. So just a reminder, I'll take this as a commercial break. You'll find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please, at any time, if you have a thought, a question for us, an idea, please put that in there, and we'll turn to that in just a little bit. But the five chapters, the five sections of the book are: first, prayer and spirituality; second, the church; third, holy women; fourth, gender and sexuality; and fifth, culture and dialogue. So these are the headings under which, after years and years of review, and then uh, reading and rereading and discussing and reflecting on this, these five kind of umbrella themes kind of rose to the surface. And maybe we can begin by talking about prayer and spirituality. On the one hand, this is the annual Madeleva Lecture at the Center for the Study of Spirituality, so you would assume everything has something to do with spirituality. And yet, we noticed that there were a handful of these Madeleva lecturers who focused explicitly on prayer, traditions of prayer, what prayer is, particularly prayer for women in the Christian tradition, and then spirituality from particular charisms, traditions, and historical periods. And so, even though one could make an argument that we could just title this book Prayer and Spirituality and everything would fit into here, there were ways in which we came to see that some of these authors were focusing on these themes in an explicit or discrete way, and by organizing the lectures in this way, and I'll just name those who are collected in this section. You have Monica Helwig, who was the inaugural lecturer that I mentioned earlier, but you also have Mary Collins, a Benedictine sister, Maria Harris, Mary Boys, who has done tremendous work in ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue, and Kathleen Norris, who is an English studies person by training, but is best known for being a kind of best-selling popular author on spirituality. And her essay in particular is really it's really interesting. I mean, all these are great. So I don't want to, by highlighting at any point one or another, I'm not excluding the rest. But Kathleen Norris's talks about the kind of everyday spirituality of what it's like to be, in her case, a lay married woman. So if there's anything that I think resonates with the alumni of St. Mary's College, if you're not a Sister of the Holy Cross, if you're not somebody who's a theologian in a traditional or academic or professional sense, but find yourself, wondering, well, what is there about faith and prayer and spirituality and doing my kids' laundry or doing the dishes or letting the dog out or going to work in the morning or filling the car with gas. These are the themes that she takes up in a really compelling way that makes it really key, like a really keen addition to something that's a chapter that's focused on prayer and spirituality. I don't know, Jess, if there's other themes from that first chapter that strike you.
Yeah, I there were a couple, and actually one of the things I was hoping to talk about was the Norris passage because I love Kathleen Norris's Madeleva lecture and what we were able to present from it here. One of the things that she sort of represents, and that's a really interesting feature of the Madeleva lecture series, I think, is the fact that while most of the lecturers are scholars of religion, spirituality, or theologians, there have been a few lecturers, including Kathleen Norris, who are not by training, academic scholars of religion, yet they have sort of distinguished themselves for their writings on spirituality. And I think it's a sort of mark of the breadth of this series that there are several people like Norris who we've been able over the years to bring in and add their own kind of interdisciplinary spiritual insight, their insights as practitioners. And as you said so well, Dan, I think she does a masterful job of talking about the importance of sort of routine and small practice in the spiritual life. That I know certainly resonates with me, but I think also just displays the wisdom of a practitioner in a way that I think is so important when we're talking about a real lived reality, like spirituality. The other one I wanted to highlight was Monica Helwig's, the first Madeleva lecture, who sort of opens this section. And one of the things that I am so struck by as I read the passage we've included from her is just how relevant her words are, not only just for kind of spiritual seekers and students of religion today, but also how she, as the first Madeleva lecturer, really foreshadowed so many kind of themes and topics that would follow her in this lecture series. And I'll just mention one. At one point in the passage that we've included from Helwig, she says that a fundamental task of spirituality is imagination. And imagination was one of those themes that we saw come up over and over and over again in these lectures. For Helwig, she is especially interested in imagination because she's thinking about how the more marginal place of women in Christian history has led women maybe to turn to alternative spiritual practices, alternative resources to live out their spiritual lives. And so she thinks because of marginalization, sometimes women have had to be more imaginative as part of their kind of spiritual lives. And that just echoes across so many of the passages we've included in this reader, which I think is really special.
It reminds me that one of the things we did, the editing of a project like this, where you have this sort of massive range of disparate themes and topics, like we've talked about, is that you have to do a lot of things at the same time, kind of concurrently over these many months and years. And one of them was just like there was an organic sort of emergence of, as you mentioned earlier, just like an inductive process, right? We were going to read this and see where the spirit led, essentially. We didn't know what we were going to title the volume either. And so I think at one point we had a couple iterations where imagination, because it comes up over and over again across these 40 years, we thought, well, this would be something with imagination. So that, there are multiple alternative titles that could have been applied to this volume. I want to highlight just one other section, and then I think we have enough time. I'd like to just read the opening paragraph of Kathleen Norris's excerpt here because I think people might enjoy it, which is to give a shout out to Mary Boyes, a Catholic religious sister and theologian who does a lot of interreligious work, especially between Christianity and Judaism. She is a longtime faculty member at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And hers is probably the longest excerpt in this first chapter that we include. And part of that is because there's such a richness to her. I mean, they're all very rich, but it was harder to chop up hers as it was because what she does is talk about how she comes to understand and deepen her own prayer as a Christian through learning to pray with her Jewish sisters and brothers. And what does the tradition of Judaism's relationship to God and the covenant and the Jewish traditions of prayer teach a Christian without just appropriating inappropriately or kind of having a superficial understanding, but to really seriously sit with our siblings from Judaism who are, the progenitors of Christianity. Remember that Jesus and the early Christians were all Jewish. And so she offers just a really interesting take on what she learns about being a person of prayer from her Jewish siblings. But if I may, I have time, right? So this is the first paragraph in the chapter from Kathleen Norris. She writes, "Laundry, liturgy, and women's work all serve to ground us in the world, and they need not grind us down. Our daily tasks, whether we perceive them as drudgery or essential, life-supporting work, do not define who we are as women or as human beings. But they have a considerable spiritual import, and their significance for Christian theology, the way they come together in the fabric of faith, is not often appreciated. But it is daily tasks, daily acts of love and worship that serve to remind us that the religion is not strictly an intellectual pursuit. And these days, it is easy to lose sight of that, as, like our society itself, churches are becoming more politicized and polarized. Christian faith is a way of life, not an impregnable fortress made up of ideas, not a philosophy, not a grocery list of beliefs." And she wrote this in 1998. So, I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same for sure.
Mm.
The second chapter, the second theme is titled "The Church," and these are again sort of like the first chapter. There are a lot of dimensions of ecclesiology, which is the fancy way we theologians talk about studying the church, throughout many of these lectures. But a number of the Madeleva lecturers focused on particularly the role of women in the church. And I think, one of my favorites here is a former professor of both of ours, actually, from Boston College, Sister Marianne Hinsdale, who wrote her Madeleva lecture was basically an intellectual history of women in theology in the United States. In fact, the title of her lecture is called "Women Shaping Theology," and it serves as the name inspired by Hinsdale's lecture for a program that the center hosts, where women scholars, women theologians from around the world gather virtually to apologize. There is a fire truck going outside my window. Um, Work to support one another in their ongoing research and professional development. So I don't know what else. I'm sure there's lots more to pick up there.
Yeah, I was also going to talk a little bit about Hinsdale's lecture, I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges of putting together this reader was that some of these lectures are very familiar to me. And Marian Hinsdale's Women Shaping Theology is, this intellectual history of women in the field that I have engaged in many settings on many occasions. One of the things that surprised me as we worked through this lecture again with the reader in mind, though, is that we ended up including a part of her lecture that I had totally forgotten about, despite my familiarity with a lot of other features of it. And that is this, I think, really beautiful reflection that she does on a question that she often gets, which is why should women stay in the Catholic Church if they feel upset about the limitations on women's roles in leadership? And she draws from the work of another feminist theologian, Mary Jo Weaver, who actually drew from her own experiences of cancer to talk about the body of Christ as a body with a cancer and one that needs to be treated and healed, right? One you can't just throw off, right? We can't just throw off our bodies. We have to care for them and sometimes struggle with them in order to make them well. And so I was just so stunned by this passage that I'd overlooked in the past, and I'm so glad we included it here.
I failed to mention the other lecturers that are included in this chapter. We went right to Marian Hinsdale, but in addition to Hinsdale, there's Denise Carmody, Catherine Hilkert, Kathy Hilkert from the University of Notre Dame. Many of you will be familiar with her and may have had classes with her in your time at St. Mary's. Kathleen Hughes, and then Catherine Clifford. One thing I'll say about Kathy Clifford, who is the most recent lecturer in that grouping, is that 2 years ago, Pope Francis named her as one of the delegates to the Synod on Synodality. So she has played a major role. She's a Canadian theologian, a very, very well respected ecclesiologist. And so it's just one of these ways in which, there's been a lot of celebration, understandably, here in the Midwest about the first American Pope from Chicago. But we can think about these Madeleva lecturers who have had such a tremendous imprint, not only in the United States and North America, but internationally as well, when it comes to theology and the Catholic Church and beyond. So, chapter 3 is titled Holy Women, and here we have contributions from Dolores Lecky, Jeanette Rodriguez, M. Sean Copeland, Ann Patrick, and as I mentioned earlier this evening, now the late Wendy Wright, whose contribution on Mary I know is particularly important to my colleague here, Jess Coblentz, because of a project you're working on. But I should also point out that, like Marian Hinsdale, Sean Copeland was a professor of both of ours. And so this is another illustration of being very close not only to the material, but to the authors themselves, which is a great blessing, a great joy. But Jess, maybe you want to get us started here.
Yeah, I mean, so this section on holy women, one of the things that kind of bring these excerpts together is they're all focused on a holy woman, right? And by holy women, we didn't necessarily have in mind canonized saints, although as you mentioned, Dan Wendy writes section is on the Virgin Mary. Jeanette Rodriguez is focused on Guadalupe. But the other women who are central to these excerpts are Sor Juana, a very influential intellectual, a sister from what is today Mexico, Henriette DeLille, a sister and influential Black Catholic from New Orleans, and our very own Sister Madeleva. So when we and our Madeleva lecturers were talking about holy women, it was really striking to see that they really had a capacious vision for that. It wasn't just these canonized saints; it was the sort of everyday holy women that also emerge from our tradition and are part of our communion of saints, which is a real delight to see.
Maybe for the sake of time, we'll just keep moving forward with the fourth grouping, which is under the heading of gender and sexuality. Again, when you think of, these 40 years, and in particular these 32/33 Madeleva lectures that we include in this volume, all authored by women scholars of some sort, right? Not all theologians. I'm about to highlight somebody who is a literature professor by training. We mentioned Kathleen Norris earlier, who is more of a practitioner and a popularizer of Christian spirituality for the masses. Um, we could say like, well, gender it kind of is found throughout, right? Which is true. But these are authors who are focusing their reflections on the role of gender and the role of sexuality in spirituality, in Christian life, especially for what it's like to be a woman in the church. And so these authors include our double hitter, Sandra Schneider's. And we should say how we get to 33 and then 32 is that we didn't include both of hers. We only included one of her lectures in this volume. So all due respect to Professor Schneider's, we didn't mean to cut you short, but we had limits on space. Um, Elizabeth Dreyer, who's a theologian of medieval history. Joan Chittister, Sister Joan Chittister, the Benedictine sister. Um, Her PhD in educational background is actually in English literature. So herself not a theologian, but somebody who, in this particular, in her lecture, and then the excerpt that we highlight, does a really powerful rereading of the book of Job in the Old Testament. Like we've been saying, like we have been familiar with most of these, and I certainly, as the director of the center, have been familiar with all of these for many years now. But going back and doing a close reading of every single one, I was blown away by Joan Chittister's writing. I mean, she's a very popular author. Many of you probably have books of hers on your shelves right now. But if you don't have her Madeleva lecture, first buy this volume to get a taste of it, and then get her volume for the whole thing. That was a little bit of an advertisement there. Um, but it's an amazing reading of a story that I think is intuitive to a lot of people, familiar to a lot of people, but what she does with it is really powerful. We also have Lisa Cahill, an ethicist, right? So we have this diversity of backgrounds and traditions and expertise. Diana Hayes, who's a womanist theologian from Georgetown University. Sydney Callahan, who Jess mentioned earlier, is a psychologist. So we have all these disciplines coming together here. Mercy Adoye, who is an African theologian and scholar, and Nancy Panina Madrid, who is a Mexican American theologian and scholar, the current president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, as a matter of fact. Um, Anything in particular, Jess, you want to lift up from this section?
In addition to affirming your praise of Chittister's reading of Job, I'll just say that, when we set out on this project, one of the concerns that I had was whether some of these lectures might feel kind of dated, especially around the topic of gender and sexuality. We know that conversations about gender and sexuality have changed really rapidly in the last 40 years. And so I was kind of worried that especially lectures that were focused on those topics might just not land in the same way today as they did then. But I was actually really, again, pleasantly surprised that while there were times where certain language might have seemed a little dated, for the most part, as you, I think, said it earlier, Dan, like, um, you know, everything changes and nothing changes. Like, a lot of the topics that we feature in this section are, um, are just as relevant today as they were, decades ago, for better and for worse. And so I think there's a lot of really compelling stuff that will still resonate with people today.
So that brings us to the last theme. And so if you have questions or comments or feedback for us, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And this is culture and dialogue. Admittedly, this is a little bit of a grab bag. It's a little bit of a catch-all. And we went back and forth about how and where to put these particular texts. Could they be a different category? Could we move others from other chapters? But the thing that kind of unites all of these excerpts under culture and dialogue is a real attentiveness that these authors had to the pressing, urgent matters of our time. So that could be in our time in the moment of the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s, or it could be a perennial concern. it could also be something that focused on dialogue across traditions. So in this chapter, we have a number of Madeleva lecturers who are interested, for instance, in theology or religion and science. So that's a dialogue, right, or an interdisciplinary approach. And a number of names here will be very familiar to many of you, including Sister Elizabeth Johnson, the renowned Catholic theologian, and an honorary Bell as the commencement speaker and degree recipient in 1994 at St. Mary's College. Margaret Farley, who's a religious sister of mercy, and something I learned only very recently is that she is one of the few women and women Catholics who is depicted in a commissioned portrait in the great reading room of Yale Divinity School. She was a faculty member at Yale, an ethicist for many years. But when you think about the school's 300 plus year long tradition, there's a lot of old white Protestant men who are lifted up as great scholars and theologians. But among these old white men of Protestant traditions, you have this amazing Catholic woman religious ethicist who is there and really venerated and honored. So that's just a connection again back to St. Mary's to these, all over the world. We also have Susan Ross, a professor from Loyola Chicago, Barbara Fiend, Kwok Pui Lan, who's a tremendous theologian who herself is not Catholic. So we have an ecumenical perspective of a theologian who brings a post-colonial and Asian perspective. Those of you who joined us earlier in the semester at the Center for the Study of Spirituality's webinar, looking back at the Madeleva lectures over the last 40 years, Puilan was one of the contributors, one of our panelists, offering very moving reflections. We also have Christine Hinsey of Fordham University, Marianne Farina, a sister of the Holy Cross, and Ilia Delio, a Franciscan sister at Villanova University, who is well known to, I think, many alumnae and sisters as well. So just a real powerhouse of reflections. Jess, any highlights there for you?
Yeah, well, like you said, this section, could be seen as a grab bag. As I was reflecting on it, though, I think it really distills the range of topics that this lecture series has covered over the last 40 years. In this section alone, we have theologians engaging with environmentalism, medicine, economics, science, as you said, other religious traditions. And so to me, it's just so exciting to see kind of even in just one section of our reader, how wide-ranging the reflections of the lectures are. There's sort of something for everyone and their interest here. And it's really impressive and I think exciting.
So we've got a few questions that are coming in already, and I'm happy to kind of get us started here. To Suzanne Foley, who asked, when is this book coming out? Good news, it is out. I believe Molly, our host from the Alumni Association, is going to share a QR code or a link to where you can find the book. But you can also find the book wherever you order books, and that includes online, like places like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. I believe our bookstore on campus, if you're coming to Reunion Weekend next week, they have it in stock there. You can get your local bookstore to order it. So Molly will provide some more information before we close tonight there. So thank you for that. And then we have a comment here, a question from somebody in the class of 1965 who asked about the October conference that we hosted at the Center on the Life and Legacy of Sister Madeleva Wolf. And I mentioned that was organized by myself, Jess here, and our colleague Susan Mancino. But Jess and Susan Mancino have been editing a volume that's going to come out. Maybe, Jess, you can talk more about that.
Yes, so we don't have recordings of the papers that were given at the conference, at the symposium, but as Dan said, Susan Mancino, who's a communications professor at St. Mary's, and I have been working to gather the papers that were delivered there from all different disciplines, from environmental studies to English to theology and spirituality. Dan has a chapter in there on spirituality. We've been gathering these together for publication, and I'm delighted to say that we actually submitted the manuscript last week to Paulus Press. So again, we owe a great debt to this publisher who has this long-standing relationship to St. Mary's through the Madeleva Lecture. They've been excited to publish this volume, and so our hope is that it will be available next year in time for the Madeleva Lecture. So we're going to have 2 years in a row where our Madeleva Lecture celebration is accompanied by a volume. And I can say with great pride that the essays on Sister Madeleva and her enduring relevance are just super exciting. Maybe I'm thinking we should have another spirituality hour and we can come talk to you all about that volume next year. I'd be delighted to.
It might even be worth to have a panel in addition to those of us here, Jess and Susan in particular, the editors, but to highlight just a few folks. Jess mentioned the kind of disciplines that are featured there, but among the contributors are President Katie Comboy, who has a chapter in this book. Have both of us, Sister Eva Hooker. Many of you know Sister Eva, an English professor and poet. Um, Dr. Tom Grady, who is happens to be the spouse of the president, Katie Comboy, but is also a scholar of Irish poetry and has an amazing chapter in there about Sister Madeleva's journey to Ireland. Sister Sandra Yoakum, not sister, Dr. Sandra Yoakum. She is our sister too in baptism, but Dr. Sandra Yoakum at the University of Dayton, who for many years was on faculty at St. Mary's. She has a great chapter on the history of the School of Sacred Theology. So I'm really excited about it. It was an awesome conference, but I'm very eager to see the book that Jess and Susan have been editing. It's going to be really awesome.
I'm Molly Allen on behalf of the Alumni Board. I want to sincerely thank Dr. Horan and Dr. Coblentz. We will take you up on that offer to do this again. It's been absolutely delightful. Um, we could listen to you, I think, all night, but as Kathleen Norris reminds us of the demands of the quotidian, we'll let everyone get back to their evenings. I do want to close with thanks. You can see here there's a QR code that will link you to purchase the book if you want to read more. And I have to note in my copy, they have dedicated this text to, it says, for our readers at St. Mary, or for our students at St. Mary's College, may you come to know and to realize your own potential for greatness. And that certainly harkens to Sister Madeleva's promise of discovery of ourselves. And so we are incredibly grateful for your time and expertise and sharing with our alumni community. And we look forward to doing it again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you.